Hello, everybody. Hi, how are you doing? Um, I'm Elena Pugia, and I'm your moderator for the day. In one of the lighthouses, and in general in this main stage. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds, and at the same time also enter my quick presentation in full screen mode, because we are also streaming live on YouTube and Facebook, and I have to wait a little bit so those two are synced, and also you guys are slowly entering the room. So I also want to give you some time to pick a seat and get your coffee and or your water and enjoy the session. So as I mentioned, my name is Elena Pugia. I'm running Data Natives, and recently got involved with both Ends, which is a new initiative, is a foundation, a pan-European foundation, aiming to help connect and help domain experts, innovators, and marginalized communities in the topics of privacy and healthcare, aiming to answer the question, how can we have both privacy and healthcare? So far today we've done a lot of exciting sessions, and right now we are I'm gonna soon introduce Amy as the next keynote for the day. Afterwards we're gonna enter the lighthouses again. We already had a session with the moderators where we discussed the key takeaways so far, and we're really excited to share the results later. We're gonna have a panel at 5:10 on open data in healthcare and how can actually we advance research whilst protecting patients' data. And as I mentioned, we're going to have the key takeaways and keynote with Cory Doctorow. So stay tuned. All times are displayed in Berlin time, so GMT +2. So, as I mentioned, right now we're having a talk with Amy Elliott, who is the design director at Simple Secure. She's going to be talking about the fields of user experience and design research that have robust methods for meeting user needs for commerce. However, the unique challenges of consenting to data collection require new approaches. Amy has 15 years of experience in human-centered design and innovation. She has led multidisciplinary teams in hardware, software, and service design for industries, including media, consumer electronics, enterprise systems, healthcare, education, financial services, and social impact. Her focus is security, privacy, and ethics through a user experience lens. Current projects in Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and secure communication. She's available for consulting and speaking engagements in Berlin and beyond. And right now for us, she's speaking here at this conference and sharing with us her experience, her journey, and her point of view on consenting to complexity. So Amy, I'm passing the torch to you. I'm gonna mute myself and stop the camera.
Thank you. And so I share my screen, I believe, is the done thing here?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Amy Elliott, speaking to you from Berlin. This is joint work done at Simply Secure with our executive director, Georgia Bullen, who is based in New York. And I'm excited to share some of our emerging work on this important theme. I'm not sure why I can't advance to the next slide. Scroll, got it, okay. So Simply Secure is an American nonprofit with a small global team centered here in Berlin. We're an official 501c3, and we're dedicated to protecting and centering vulnerable populations. And that is because we deserve, everyone deserves, not we, everyone deserves technology that they can trust. And the image that we see here is me out in the field in New York, learning from an expert power user of mobile messaging. And this is a human-centered design technique of kind of an in situ, ethnographically inspired observation about how how this woman is managing all of her communications. And this kind of human-centered design process is something that we felt really strongly about as a way to center vulnerable populations. So Simply Secure's activities include design, UX, and strategy support. For example, we partner with a number of different organizations. We've worked with Tor, Mozilla, other kinds of organizations as well. We do open research and develop tools. So on our website, which I'll share at the end, you can get some examples of toolkits for how to support developers that are working on IoT projects and trying to get information about security, and a number of other kinds of toolkits. And then kind of the third element of our work is around building community and hosting convenings. Our signature event is called Underexposed. It's taken place every year for the past 5 years, and recent topics have included algorithmic accountability and secure messaging. So consent. I would like to just take a second and talk about what consent means in the context of user experience design and design research. So here in Berlin, there are a number of different bike sharing apps, and also scooters and these kinds of objects or new pieces of urban infrastructure in the public. And in order to use them, people completely expect that by pairing their mobile phone and downloading this app, that the owners of these bikes can track where they are. The normal way to use them is by taking a picture with your phone as a camera of a barcode, and then you and the bike and the phone are all associated. That is kind of front and center in the mental model of how these works. And from a user experience design, the designers who put these pixels and these words and these dialog boxes and these arrows on screen, this is entitled to work with a big fat thumb. The only real option here is continue, and it is designed to encourage people to agree to all terms. So in contrast to the world of nonprofits and NGOs and activists that are kind of much more concerned with intentionality and education and awareness, the consumer UX is all about being seamless, making it effortless, and reducing every possible point of friction to get as many fat thumbs clicking continue so that this business of bike sharing can make money. Now, if people have the clear mental model, they expect the bike sharing app to track their location. If you look in the Android app permissions, you can see that the permissions are actually pretty aggressive. The Mobike, one of the bike sharing apps, wants to be able to make phone calls and access your storage and learn about what's on your home screen. And there may be really excellent developer reasons for these permissions. That's kind of a feature of how an Android app ecosystem is put together. But this is often extremely surprising to people that this app that they have on their phone is effectively tracking them. And I'll just flag that one of the kind of current events that I think a lot of designers are thinking about these days are the context of Corona tracking apps and exactly what information is being gathered. So the simple bike share has 33 screens on mobile of their terms and conditions. T and C stands for terms and conditions. It's not designed to be read. There's no expectation someone's going to stand on the street and next with their big fat thumb through 33 of these screens. However, there are some big surprises in there. For example, this is snipped and highlighted from the terms. The terms and conditions can be updated at any time with no notice. By continuing to use the bike, you're agreeing to the updated terms. And some things in here about while you're using the service, you may not submit, upload, or publish any defamatory content. And This gets right to the heart of a set of complex legal issues. Defamatory to whom? Mobike is a Chinese company. Where's the data stored? What is considered defamatory? And we do not have a mechanism at present for thinking about these issues and whether or not people understand. Through the forces of capitalism and the expansion of the proliferation of ever more devices and ever more services, we know quite a bit about how to get people to agree to go forward and spend money. We do not know that much yet about how to communicate consent in a meaningful way. So this is an artist named Dima Yarovinsky, and these are kind of a gallery style exhibition of some different services, terms and conditions. The purple that goes on the floor is Instagram. So by participating in Instagram, you're agreeing to all of this stuff, and nobody really knows what this is. So I've talked a bit about bike sharing and mobile, which has a bunch of really, really difficult concerns because you're perhaps out on the street, it could be raining or something like that. But let's just take it back to the desktop, to a context or a laptop of someone, for example, in a web browser, where you have all 10 of your fingers and good clear focus and lots of space for stuff. Right now, in the European Union, due to the GDPR regulations, people are developing a really specific kind of banner blindness because these consenting to to cookie use and things like this are so ubiquitous. People aren't reading it. You may have a choice of whether you see a tooltip or a bar, but basically this is firmly the land of the big green button that says accept. In this example from website policies, or down in the lower right, something from The Guardian, okay. Really what you're supposed to do is say, okay. We get it. This website uses cookies. Big green button. Okay. So I would speculate that is not actually meaningful consent in any way. People have a particular task that they're trying to do, and they are just going to agree to anything in order to be able to do it. So we need to shift from this banner blindness complacency in order to something that's truly consent. And that's kind of the consent part. And the premise there is that because of the push to get people kind of spending money and using products and services, Silicon Valley style human-centered design gives us great tools for making things seamless. And part of that is hiding complexity. So what are some friction points where we actually see complex interfaces? Well, how do we know what people understand online? These examples of CAPTCHAs from services like Google interrupt our web experience and provoke us and demand a response. The purpose of this kind of thing is to confirm that people are humans and not part of a bot network, potential threat for something like DDoS attacks. And the general idea here is that people need to type in text, and there are huge challenges in the accessibility community, specifically around people who may have difficult perceiving this. Is it possible to have something audio? And then the example on the right is much more provocative. Many places that use Google services see these. And then, of course, once a company has this information of this massive unpaid labor force clicking on helicopters or statues or roads to help autonomous driving cars, we don't actually know how companies like Google are using this information. But this is an example of people essentially consenting to prove their humanity in order to move through. Now, what if we take these examples and make them a little bit, push them a little bit further and see where this starts to break? So on the right, the black image here is something new, a new feature coming up in Twitter, which it's encouraging people to read an article before retweeting. And it's intended as part of an effort to manage misinformation or disinformation or elevate the quality of discourse. But it's a very kind of new provocation where it can easily be dismissed, but how does this actually work? What if you read it on a different device? Like, how does the login session management happen? There are a lot of open questions beyond just putting some words here. The example on the left is green, which is kind of building on the please pick the parts of the helicopter. And it says, just to prove you're human, please answer the following math challenge. This is not something that I would be equipped to put into a mandatory field. It would take some doing for me. So now you know my secret weakness of calculus. So this is an example that I think is actually pretty interesting and provocative. OONI is a censorship measurement tool, and part of their installation wizard actually has a quiz. So in order to start using their software, you have to correctly answer some fairly complex understandings, questions to test your understanding about how the system works. And in some ways, I think that this is an example that we could think about emulating, specifically around the cases of giving data, giving personally identifiable user-generated data from things like browsing sessions. But really, I think that the provocation of this example, leveraging things like online learning to test that people are actually understanding it, should really just be the first of a whole series of new kinds of experiments and prototypes and provocations that we would like to see to start getting closer to how people understand complex topics such as consent. So I'm going to share, just at a very, very brief level, some of Simply Secure's emerging work in complex consent. And kind of schematically, data governance is kind of at the intersection of a bunch of things. So I think it's important to point out surveillance capitalism. I've mentioned business models and how business models and the desire to drive user adoption and page views and downloads has really informed a lot of what we know about human-centered design, because it's about making it easy for people to spend money. But there are, of course, other examples: elections, online polarization, and then some of these critically, socially, very, very urgent topics like discrimination. We know that algorithmic accountability is incredibly difficult, and we know that people of color are systematically discriminated against by a number of automated decision-making systems. And as a community, we have got to work together to center different voices and come up with data governance frameworks that can be more just. So two kind of quick examples of work that we at Simply Secure have done are partnering with Firefox on a project called Pioneer, which is an opt-in platform for people to participate in user research and donate their data. And then Tracking Exposed is another project that we've worked with that's about exposing algorithms of how things like Facebook organize your feed. So another element of this ongoing work is building a pattern library. Both the Algorithms Exposed work and Pioneer are browser plugins. So again, I'm not talking about mobile and big fat thumb. I'm talking about assuming really concentrated attention on a task in a web browser. A web browser plugin could allow people to voluntarily opt in to donate data to researchers to start to, some cases, potentially reverse engineer how algorithms work. And it's a very provocative and interesting example. But at a basic level, the ways in which the browser extensions as a UX element work are pretty subtle and pretty complicated. So we have been just doing a kind of a documentation pattern library of what we're seeing as being effective in terms of communicating to people from non-technical backgrounds how the data that they're generating in a browser window may be interacting with other apps or other services. Just one specific example of what that might mean is password managers like 1Password operate as a browser extension. They also can have a desktop app, and then there can also be something in a Mac interface that kind of lives in the menu bar, and they're kind of these three different points of how things work. So this is a place that we would like to kind of partner and work with more people to understand how can we make consent more effective. So I am going to wrap up this fairly quick talk with a provocation. For all of my career, I've identified as a human-centered designer, a user-centered designer, HCD, human-centered design. And what I understood that to mean was a way of caring for people, for humans, thinking of them not as or only as customers, but really how to enable them to do what they want, and how to be kind of an activist or user advocate, specifically around centering and protecting vulnerable populations. But the toolkit of methods that we have in user-centered design and design research are not going to help us with these extremely challenging problems like consent. Consent is much more complex than proving that you're human. At the beginning of this talk, I showed an example of a qualitative, ethnographically inspired way of learning from someone about their technology use practices. A/B testing is another method that's quantitative, running at scale, putting different kinds of interfaces with different kinds of words in dialog boxes in front of people to understand how they behave. And this kind of method assumes that there's some kind of baseline scale of what good looks like. Usually it's something like people spent more money, the average spend was higher, page time on page was longer, number of downloads, something like that. But the reason we cannot do this A/B testing for dialog boxes around consent is we do not know what good looks like. As a provocation, if you put up a dialog box and 75% of the people say, okay, accept, hit that big button and move on, great, that's case A. In design B, what if 50% of the people encounter the dialogue and then only 50%, or if 100% of the people come to the design B and only 50% of them move on? What does that mean? We could speculate that dialog box B is more effective at communicating consent because fewer people said yes. But we don't actually know that that's true. This is an area where we need more research. It could be that it is badly worded. It could be that people didn't understand. There are just too many different variables at play. And what we need to do is come up with new forms of inquiry around the topics of consent, specifically consent in complex situations. To do this, we need a holistic approach, a multidisciplinary approach to reimagining human-centered design for the challenges ahead, so that we can come up with ways of supporting meaningful consent on these very complex challenges related to things like data donation, transparency, and privacy. So I will say thank you and quickly close with a plug. We are a nonprofit, and we have a knowledge base with different topics. If you're new to any of these kinds of topics and would like to get started on UX, we have a UX starter pack. And we also host a Slack that's open to the community. If you screenshot this page, or you can reach out in the contact information on the next page for how to do that. So that is us. And I included a picture of our executive director, Georgia Bullen, since she could not be here. And I guess with that, I will stop my share and toss it back to Elena.
Hi, Amy. Thank you very much for your presentation. And with your provocation in the end, I'd like to ask you a question to follow up and close this session. Okay. So are you saying then basically that human-centered design is good or bad? And how can we, what's the next step? What kind of professional tools do we need to actually reach the point, the conclusion of consent, as you mentioned, the complexity of consent?
Human-centered design is good. I think it is worth noting that it is a field that has matured and is sturdy enough to stand up to some inquiry and poking at it and prodding at it and trying to make it better. And in order to do that, I think that we need to see more, in order to meet the challenges of consent and complexity, I would like to see more experiments like the OONI quiz, like reimagining how to make captures that aren't so discriminatory or inaccessible. We need a new kind of language and methodology for starting provocative conversations.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to have you at this session. We will have to end it faster than we will have to speed up because we have in 4 minutes the next lighthouse, but I think you gave us enough provocation to continue our discussion. I see actually there's some heated debate and conversations happening by some attendees here in the chat. If you want to reach out to Amy, I believe you gave us your contact details. Please do so.
You're welcome to reach out, or you can also try contact@simplysecure.org. It's difficult in a venue like this to not be able to see and interact with people, so please feel free to reach out digitally. We're learning, we're trying to learn from other people that are doing this work and see what we can come up with together, because these issues are just really critical and timely and important. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, so everybody here that you're here now, we are moving slowly to the lighthouses. So we have the 4 lighthouses: the privacy, healthcare, civil society, and privacy, health, and tech. So see you all there. And again, Amy, thank you. Then I will continue. We're just gonna go back. We're just gonna go back to the ones that we already introduced in the end. But then let me just start then with Ali this time. So Ali, hello. Thank you very much for joining us. So me and Mike are here to co-moderate this discussion. And I would like to start by presenting our panelists. So Ali is the design lead at Field. She worked on a broad array of projects, from public health software for NGOs and nonprofits to shiny brand experiences at agencies, like a Color Bride and Ice Lab. She'd like to live in a place where sunscreen is a necessity. Me and you both, Ali. I actually, yeah, I wanna be always in the sun, but makes you in Berlin. She travels as much as humanly possible, where right now not really, and spends a lot of her time working in West Africa. Well, great to meet you, Ali.
Great to meet you.
Wow. Well, it's an honor to introduce Dr. Giovanna Jaramillo Gutierrez. And Giovanni is an epidemiologist, a data scientist, a lifelong learner driven by the ethical use of AI to solve business challenges related to the SDGs. Can you help me elaborate on that really quick?
Sustainable United Nations goals.
And you're working on algorithmic impact assessments to uncover unwanted bias, gender, race derived from the use of machine learning algorithm-based products and services for high-stake decision-making in the context of health or social outcomes. And you're also the co-founder of Milana and Associates. It is an honor to have you present on our panel today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would like to introduce to everybody Johannes, for the ones who are actually watching us on the live stream, who is currently, this is the first thing he did today, this morning, because he's based in Silicon Valley, but he's actually originally from Germany. He's an entrepreneurial geek, and currently working on indie computing, which brings your personal data home on hardware that you control without having to be much of a system administrator. And he also has done a project called App A for COVID-19 that analyzes app created to fight the virus. So Johannes, pleasure to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Last but not least,
I think that's it. Is Rav here, or is this our complete panel? Elena?
That's true. Yes, we are. That's it. You're right. That's it.
I think we're ready to start the conversation.
We're ready to start the conversation. Yes. Great. So let's kick this off. Mike, would you like to start with asking a question yourself first?
Well, let's just get right into the meat of it. So how can we conduct research while protecting patient data? Each one of you can give us a 2-sentence definition of what is patient data. Start with you, Dr. G.
So basically, patient data can be mainly medical data, but as well behavioral data. So any data that will help us actually diagnose disease. So it can be biometric data, or as well investigation data about behavior. For example, during contact tracing, you have to ask contextual data.
So interesting. So we're expanding the definition. Many of us think of it more in a clinical situation, that clinical data might be what comes from the machine that goes ping. Very interesting. Allie, what is your take on this?
Yeah, collecting patient data, like you can collect like various types of data that make someone identifiable. So that might be name and location, but it can also be like age, gender, stuff like that. So there are a lot of sort of technical standards around this, and a lot of design considerations when you're designing to collect that data to sort of ensure security on a technical standpoint.
Very interesting. Now, Johannes, you're involved with transporting this data. So how do you define this patient data?
So let me take the side of the user here, as I usually do, or the patient or whoever's data it is. And I look at it as whatever data you want from me. And I consider the data that is mine, that's related to me. It's personal on some level because it's medical. And you have to convince me that I should be trusting you with that data. Whether that's my blood type or what it is where I went yesterday is really not relevant so much from my perspective. What is relevant is that you convince me very clearly that this is in my interest, in the interest of the world, and the downsides are very small if I participate.
So we have a pretty broad definition here of the data. So how could we define a standard? Because we would need to, it sounds very amorphous. So this is where I'd like to draw the conversation. How can we define a standard when we have such a broad description and definition of patient data?
When you say standard, what are you trying to define? From my perspective, the standard is the governance around what that data is and how it gets exchanged. For example, if you look at the current COVID apps, there is everybody and their brother seems to be developing COVID apps, and they ask for all sorts of information. There's some categories that are really well known, like contact tracing or remote, patient management or self-diagnostics. There's all sorts of categories, but there's a lot of innovation happening. So the kind of data that is being collected is different all the time. And that's good because innovation is happening. The interesting question is, once I provide that data, what happens? And how can I be certain that what you promised me is actually what will happen?
So you mentioned it's something very strong. The standard, the standard is the governance. We're not necessarily looking at a standard based on bits or data. We're looking at governance. So Dr. Giovanna, as a doctor, and also you had your recent experience in the AI bootcamp, what is your interpretation of this? How do you see this regarding governance versus bits?
Yes, thank you for bringing this up. So basically, we are at a very interesting intersection where we actually have the technology to really improve public health, like in the context of COVID, and there's an interest, right? So I think from one part, it's really positive because everybody wants to help. So a lot of tech companies are coming forward and are offering solutions. But I think we really need to match the problem owners with the tech solutions, right? Because you need to understand the whole public health system. For example, you mentioned the contact tracing apps. In that respect, I think there's a lot of confusion and we should really think contact tracing as a more global measure of that has been in place for other diseases, for example, for Ebola. And within contact tracing, there's the component of the use of digital tools that can help to collect data quickly. this needs to be very well defined within the public health system. Why do we need a digital tool like an app? And how is this data going to be collected? What is going to be used for, and transparency towards the user? How is this data collected? And depending on the country you're in, the regulations are different. So this has been a bit of a debate in public health. At the moment, I think it is welcome that we have more digital tools, but we are at the moment that we don't have yet the monitoring and evaluation KPIs, if you want, that actually we can say, yes, it has been implemented and it's helpful by this much, for example. No? So
this is very interesting. So I know Ali's a designer. So what's your design perspective here? Because it sounds like we're talking that design is a very critical aspect of managing this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot there are, we haven't really talked about like consent as well in these sort of data gathering operations. I know there's a lot of conversation around it right now with the COVID tracing apps that Apple and Google have released. But like, you know, how, like, whose data are you collecting and what do they know about it? Have they sort of, do they know what they're giving consent to if they're asked for consent? And can they revoke that consent? And like, how does that balance against like those sort of individual privacy rights? How do they balance against the public health considerations here? So there are huge design questions about like how you make this visible to end users, what you say to them, and like what kind of interaction they can have with that whole system.
We have a comment from someone who's watching mentioning that governance can be changed. So can we address this as well? We're discussing privacy and it looks like one of the solutions is governance, but as we see from my former country, governance can change.
So if I can jump in here for a second. So within Project AppSA, we are looking at two broad questions. One of which is, does the technology being thrown at the disease actually make a difference? And by and large, nobody actually knows this. Contact tracing, for example, electronically, nobody has proven this at all, that it makes a difference. Manually it does, but electronically we don't know. The second one is, if I as a user contribute, what are the risks and what are downsides that might happen to me if I contribute? And there is the question of who is making which assurances and how can I prove to myself and to other people that these assurances are actually true, and to the point that was just made in that chat, how can we make sure that they remain true? For example, one of the things we have found in some of the apps that we have assayed is that they have the word privacy all over the place. You know, use our app, it's all private, 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 it's all perfect. And then you look in detail, and it turns out, because the app is government sponsored, that it is private. The data you provide is private to everybody except for the government. Of course, they wouldn't announce that particularly publicly, but it's not entirely unexpected. Secondly, I would be not surprised if we find out 6 months down the road that some apps that were private today aren't going to be as private 6 months down the road because the governance can be changed. So we need mechanisms. Some of them are technical and some of them are governance, and particularly we need third-party involvement where we can be quite certain that what we get is what we think we get. And design is a part of this one. You know, there's nothing misleading in it, but it is also, because some of the people who build these apps simply lie. Okay, just take it.
On that note, actually, I would like to, I like this observation that actually things are changing. And of course, like there's a lot of information that is withheld from us and we don't know exactly how our data might be used. But then I would ask then, what is the role of ethics for technology and data professionals now? And how can that role change, perhaps, to be someone that would make that potential change in the system?
Speaking as a technologist, if I may, I think before we get to ethics, we have more basic problems. One of which is that the vast majority of technologists that have been hired to build these things do not actually know the first thing about how to make anything privacy preserving. And what the technologies are. It's simply a competence problem. So we can't blame them for being not ethical if they don't know any better. So the first thing we need to do is teach them how to do this. And one thing we're trying to do in FSA is outlining how other people have done this. For example, in our contact tracing, we have now, I don't know, at least half a dozen different technical approaches for how to do that. They have pros and cons. And if we make them transparent, if I implement yet another contact tracing app, I can say, oh, this probably worked over here. I might not understand this particular technology, but I can find out. And once we get there, and we have actually, then when people still don't do the right thing, then we can ask what exactly is going on here. And in the Western world, we are relatively at liberty. Our development teams are relatively at liberty to do the right thing. But in many countries where that is not true, there is all sorts of things that's being slipped underneath the hood, because of course, 24/7 always on mobile phone apps are a surveillance person's absolute wet dream. It doesn't get any better than this. So if you want to ever slip in anything anywhere, this is your opportunity.
Well, I'm wondering if anyone else would disagree with you, Johannes.
This is a panel. We have to disagree with each other. So somebody please disagree.
Let's get a doctor's perspective. We have a technologist perspective, but as a doctor, do you share these same concerns, or do you have a different opinion, Giovanna?
Well, look, this is really new to, from the public health perspective, this is very new to us because normally when we develop digital tools, it's really done with the stakeholders, and it takes time to understand. There's really a work on social science now, anthropology, understand the context of the local level to really understand the needs. Because we're in a crisis, these apps are just popping up everywhere, and it's there's such a need that it seems to me that there's not much time to really have these conversations beforehand. We have to have them anyway, but this is a bit like people make the apps and then we're like, okay, we have to use them. But actually, there's a whole process, right, of as we mentioned before, data governance. Where is that data being stored? Who is going to have access to that data? Consent, as was mentioned before. So before, I work with pen and paper, and then we go to the district health unit and we do data entry. Like, this is how we do it. So it's not as fast, but this is a traditional way of doing it. And in the context of contact tracing, we have to have in mind that time is really sensitive, right? So whatever can be needed to help make a decision, to gather information, of course, people would want to use it. But again, this is health data. It's not clicks or shares in Facebook. We have to really be cautious and consider it very differently. And I think when people design an app, there should be a multidisciplinary approach to it and involve people in ethics, philosophers if needed. Especially, this is the first time that we have such a degree of involvement, right, from the tech companies in public health. So I don't
honestly, like, the ethics really need to guide the technology. Like, the technology is just a tool, and it's usually not even a very good one, as Johannes alludes to. Like, there are no real standards around a lot of this technology, and so like the ethics need to come first before the technology. Like, you drop a piece of software on a problem and it never solves it. It never does. Like, it's just there to sort of like help the systems and the ethics that we have in place.
Can I suggest something? In my observation, I think this is the very first time, this pandemic is the first time that we throw consumer level technology at health questions and at a massive scale. Before that, we did it at the margins, but this is the first time we throw it at a massive scale. So of course, we don't know these things. This is all new. That's the whole point. But this is the opportunity for us to figure out how to do this. And we may not get it right for the apps that are being deployed against COVID today, because it may be a little too late. But we can learn in the process as to what works and what doesn't, or what should be done. But right after that, or if there's ever an after this pandemic, but there will be other places where we're going to throw health technology at consumer technology at the health problem. And we want to reuse the exact same frameworks. You know, for example, I would like to know that the app that I'm downloading from the App Store is actually the app whose source code sits on GitHub. I mean, if I want to slip something in, that'd be really easy, right? Publish some code and say, it's all open source. Here, look at it. And then you deploy something else. I mean, I would like to know that this is the same thing. I would like to have some independent oversight board that looks where the backup tapes go, right? I mean, nobody will ask these questions. Oh, it's open source, it's great. Well, I would like to know, what happens to the backup tapes and how exactly product decisions are being made. Is there a whistleblower process in your operations? If there isn't a whistleblower process, why wouldn't you have a whistleblower process if somebody screws up with some personal data? We can set these things up once and reuse it all over the place. And I think COVID is the opportunity to do that, for one, because there's so much money and so much economic benefits, basically, that can be unleashed, or downsides that can be avoided if we do this right.
So you're seeing an opportunity in this crisis for us to shape how we are using data, and perhaps a way to have governance structures that will protect the data. Is that what you're saying? Do I understand that right?
I'm an entrepreneur in the middle of Silicon Valley, of course, as the opportunity. No, but look at this one, right? Nothing ever happens if people say, this is all terrible, stop. Okay, it doesn't stop. Okay, the question is, what can we do and how do we do this correctly? If I am, and I'm not, but if I were a developer that being charged to build the contact tracing app for country X, I do my darn best, and that may not be terribly good because I'm not an expert in public health or in contact tracing, any of these things, but I need the tools to do this right. I don't know anything about governance. If I work for Facebook all day long, how should I know how to treat Facebook data, health data correctly? I mean, I'm not going to learn that from my osmosis around when I work at Facebook. So I need to be told how to do this. And as a developer, I'm very willing to pick up all sorts of good stuff, but it has to actually work. So I want somebody to show me it works and how to make it work, and I will be very willing to do that. What I'm not willing to do is put myself into a 6-month project that consists, of 3 meetings a day. Sorry, I'm playing the technology advocate here for a second.
Yeah, I think that this panel has very interesting multidisciplinary opinion, like diverse, but it comes from around. Back to the healthcare also question, and I suppose also the as we were saying before, the ethical part. Actually, an anonymous attendee is asking here, do the panel think that ethics has come before tech up to now in the field of data? Arlie?
That's a very hard question to give a yes or a no to be honest. I mean, I think that there is a lot of work put into, at government and intergovernment level at least, into the documentation of like the system in which this data is gathered. But we know that that corruption exists, and that we see systems in government breaking down like all over the world right now. And so at this particular moment in time, like with coronavirus, with the contact tracing going on right now, I don't know. I don't think there's any one source of power for this or truth.
We have a great question that basically, what is ethics? And I would add to this, are we looking at ethics for the individual or ethics for the collective? And where they diverge, how do we address this? As a doctor, public health specialist, what do you think, Giovanna?
It's really the principle of do no harm, Is your system, whether it's an app, whether it's a diagnostic tool, based on machine learning and using a health data set, is your system transparent and fair? Does it treat people differently according to race and gender? It's all these principles of fairness, transparency, accountability that need to be embedded from the beginning of the design of the technology.
So a principle that do no harm. Is this a guideline we could all perhaps agree upon? A high level guideline that we don't want to do any harm. It's in the details, but.
I think the difficulties are in the trade-offs, and those trade-offs are culturally dependent as well. So for example, let's take for a second a hypothetical example that we will have to all publish our movements for 4 weeks, every single thing, GPS publicly. In exchange, we can save 1,000 people from dying from the disease. Let's assume there was such a trade-off. And there may be trade-offs like this, I don't know. Some countries and some cultures will make that trade-off differently than others. I don't think we can see there is one baseline because there are trade-offs. So the question is, how do we make these trade-offs transparent and have an educated discussion about it so we do the right thing that is right for us? And the trade-offs for somebody who's white and male like me might be different for somebody who's not. But as we see in Southeast Asia, some things that would be completely unacceptable in Western democracies about tracing and surveillance seem to have worked just well, both on a disease level and on a social acceptance level somewhere in Southeast Asia. I don't think there is one single answer to this.
Well, how do we ensure that technology remains a servant to the humans and not the master that controls us? This is a question from someone who's watching.
The master, huh?
Wow. Yeah, this is like the in-between part, like that no one knows. This is why technology is becoming our master. It's like completely decentralized, and there are huge profit motives behind it. So it's not an easy question, that one. I mean, Apple and Google right now have deployed the most effective public health contact tracing in their apps against coronavirus. And there's no transparency there.
Can I jump on there for a second here? As a technologist, the only thing they have given us is a bunch of primitives to build from. And these are good primitives, no question, but they're primitives. The apps that build on top of them can be completely benign and can be completely evil. Just because some particular app uses that framework doesn't tell us anything. I just want to be very clear about that. We need to look into a lot more detail than just what that framework gives us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess we also need to ask, there's a question from the audience. We also need to ask to which humans actually. So which humans are we specifically addressing to? Again, that goes back to what Johannes was saying, that the needs, depending on where you come from or who you are different. And that's why we need to design technology differently. We have 4 minutes till the next session commences. So I would like to ask to this important question that we all started with, this conversation on how can we balance things out to actually, and I would even argue that that's the fundamental of the whole summit, is how can we balance research and innovation at the same time preserving privacy? What will be your closing statements, Giovanna?
I think I really welcome this conversation, and I think different different disciplines should work together. And a way of really having everybody's opinion is to involve the people that are impacted by this, meaning the populations, the public health, healthcare people, the technologists, the people that work in ethics. It needs to be really a consultation that needs to be done so that people are heard. And at the design level, we need to involve more people than just the technologists. It's obvious that they need feedback from the people that are impacted by this technology. So I'm really happy to thank you for having me, and this is a great way to start having a community to talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ali, what's your perspective? How would you feel?
Yeah, I mean, these are big and difficult questions, and there are bound to be mistakes along the way, and there are a lot of different disciplines and systems involved in in both of those things. And so I think like transparency is what we really need to, it should be something that guides us, like transparency in these systems, in the decisions that come behind these systems and from the data that we pull out of it. And this is something that needs to guide us all, and it's something that like transparency is what we all need to demand in all of these systems and processes.
Personally, I think we've done a lot of talk, not we here, but the world has done a lot of talking around this. I think we need to go to the next stage after the talking. I think we know what the points are by and large. We need to actually start practicing this, which means I think we need to stick our heads together and actually design templates that can be applied out of the box for specific examples, essentially governance templates. And these are hard and it's not clear exactly who should work on them. But if I'm building another contact tracing app, just like today, I'm pointing to a predefined open source license. I'm not defining my license myself. I'm just picking one. I could pick a governance framework. And all of a sudden, the discussion becomes much simpler because now I can say, do I use this, or this app with these governance frameworks with these pros and cons, and how can we improve it in the next version? And we don't go back to having to look at doing one at a time, have the discussion about every single one. I'm educating everybody again. So I would like to, everybody who wants to make progress on actually defining these kind of frameworks to reach out to others who want to do this, myself included, because we need them. I don't know exactly where and how this will be done, but it needs to get done.
I really like the way this this concluded, because I do think that's actually really much related to all the learnings, at least that I have collected from this 2 days so far, on what are the next steps. Enough how activists need to take action now, and really put structure into effect and really use specific templates, as you mentioned, like for specific use case to really move out of the theoretical arm and really step by step create a different world and change it the way that we want it to be changed. So thank you very much. Mike, do you want to add something as well?
There was an amazing conversation, and I boil it down to inclusion, transparency, and governance.
Great 3 words. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here with us, all the panelists. Thank you very much, Mike, for co-moderating. And I believe right now it's exactly the time when we are entering the next session. Well, we are actually sharing all of our key takeaways from today. All of the moderators and some active contributors will do that. And also we have the keynote with Cory Doctorow. I'll be sharing my screen as well. I would ask you, thank you very much to the panelists. Let's give a round of applause. And I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, to mute yourself and turn off your camera, so then we make space for the new panelist to join. Thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen. I think, is this it? No, I think this is it. Can you let me know if you can see it? Thank you. All right. So we're staying here, by the way. Yes, I think I made that clear. We're all staying here. The live is continuing, and we're staying here to discuss the next to have the next session. I'll put it now on full screen. Where is? Okay, so transparency by design. What a day it was. Second day now. So for whoever haven't memorized my face or my name, this is me, Elena Pugia, and I am one of the moderators also of the summit. Also collaborated together with organized it as Data Natives and collaborate with both END, which is a non-profit organization that just spinned off after this Corona times and aims to do a lot of great things. We are here to lay the foundations right now with this summit as a first one of many. This is the agenda for tomorrow. I'm already I know we're yet to really digest what happened today, but I want you also to think about what's going to happen tomorrow as the last step of these 3 days, and to inform you of some key items in the agenda. So for sure, number one, we're going to have a kickoff tomorrow, same time, early for all the early birds. All the times, by the way, are Berlin times. So for the ones who are not based in Berlin, that means that you either need to stay up late at night and watch this because it's important to be here, or if you cannot do this, then you can always watch the recording afterwards. So we're going to do a kickoff tomorrow, and Stuart Rogers will be in conversation with Maxime, who is an AI researcher, and talk about the topics that we already touched upon, the data science, on data ethics and AI. We're going to kick off the lighthouses. We already have some key takeaways that we've established that we want to share with you today. But tomorrow we're really going to conclude and try to reach our 3 objectives for the summit. We're going to have a debate on protocols and certification, which are quite important for us as an objective, and a panel on how can citizens feel free. Pretty philosophical and broad question. And we will end this day with, with announcing the final results. So what has been actually the conclusion? What are the next steps? What have we achieved in the last 2 days? 3 days, and we will finish, of course, with final presentations from all lighthouses and a keynote by Catherine Townsend, who is the CEO of data.org, another NGO that has similarly a mission to use data for social good, and some live music fun. So, all right, I would like now to welcome the moderators of these days to give us some key takeaways. So, David, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So we have 4 points. We started with one of the action points is awareness and education, starting from the bottom of the chain in early childhood, and to model after successful implementation such as Argentina. The next point is about mental health hygiene. How do we help people help themselves be more aware and better understand the impact their habits, digital and other, have on their mental health as a means of prevention? Universal healthcare, not universal. Study the healthcare models and systems existing and at work, how and why, and then take and implement globally. And mental health stigma. What can we do to reduce the stigma about mental health and make it part of the answer to how are you? And promote sharing how we are feeling in every situation, especially at work or in our professional lives. That's it for me.
It seems, well, great takeaways. Thanks very much for sharing and for the great.
There was much more, but taking 4 was hard.
Okay, I see. But there's definitely a common denominator about mental health and how we can actually take the conversation forward, and how to have a universal healthcare systems, if anything, and raise awareness and education. Thank you so much, David, for the work you've been doing so far, and looking forward to see the results tomorrow. All right, so Ansela, are you here as well?
Yes, I am. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you though.
Yeah, I think it's fixed now.
Hi.
Okay, hi. Hello. Yes, happy to share our takeaways. We've been talking about privacy policy, and we've hammered so much on trust. That is important. That is also important to go for a decentralized model where we as individuals can choose which certified organizations or companies or institutions we want to share our data with. And we also talked about the importance of data literacy. There are a lot of people who don't know how their data is processed, is used. And for that, one of our speakers gave a really great quote. She said, we have to reach people where they are. We have to talk about data literacy, not in a 58 pages report, but through like a TikTok video. And we need to make it accessible. So really how to simplify data privacy, data protection for the ordinary man to understand. The last point being inclusivity. It's important that all voices are heard. We cater to minority groups, we cater to everybody. And with diversified voice and opinions, I think we are closer to the solution. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ansela. I like how these takeaways are somehow feel like they are interlinked, and one leads to the other, and in the end, it will be a very beautiful mashup. On that note, back to you, Laird, about the key takeaways from tech.
Sure, happy to do it. Just before I get into that, I'd just like to comment, I'm sure, on an experience that all of the moderators had. For instance, I'm doing the tech stack today, but the participants, some were technical, some people from healthcare, some designers, educators, very philosophical types. So it was really fascinating to see how many different takes were coming at the same problem from all of these different directions. So it was really fascinating for me. So I think if I have to distill down to 4, I would say that the technology, almost as a working premise for us, can't solve problems unless it has the correct information. So we really have to expand the voices we include in discovery. And the counter to that, one of our participants was saying, who does a lot of work in the corporate sector, is that of course, this is needed, but within the corporate sector, or at least his experience, I believe it's especially in the UK, there's a lot of resistance to doing proper market research. And even when it is done, who gets to control the interpretation of that data? Another fascinating piece that came out from a healthcare professional who works at UCL in London. There are a lot of big gaps between public and private sectors, especially where the private sector is more advantaged in terms of training, technology, and resources. And the struggle is to find some kind of balance between these two systems. Then finally, technical solutions can only be more broadly adopted if government takes the lead to educate citizens. Perhaps a question off the back of that is, can we, fully, not operate, but can we fully explain to citizens really what they need to know to start understanding technology, even in a fairly basic way? I think because we're all locked in a technical bubble, we have a lot of assumptions about how tech is used, but it's really not the common practice. So we have to work a little more towards that. That is it for me.
Thank you, Laird. And last but certainly not least is the key takeaways from civil society. They are really here as bullet points, but essentially the conversation that started, and I see a lot of correlation with already what has been discussed by Ansela and Laird and David. It's more how there's an intersection and the need for interdisciplinarity when it comes to the infrastructures that we have. So there's a need for change, in the way that our system work and simplify those systems. And there's a need for the different infrastructure, the different institutions to communicate with each other and actually to use methodologies that they have established to perfect or optimize those systems. So a lot of the times conversation came back and back again, starting from the question of, okay, so grassroots movements, can they become mainstream? And if they become mainstream, would that help the grassroots movement or would that dilute that movement? And if it is diluted, is that a bad thing or a good thing? And then again, if a grassroots movement becomes mainstream, does that mean that it teaches something to the mainstream? And at the same time, does the mainstream teach something to the grassroots movement? And all of this were going again and again in circles, and we were really trying to boil it down to what has been a successful grassroots movement. And we, of course, observed also what's going on in the last couple of weeks with Black Lives Matter, in the past there were, in the last couple of years with Fridays for Future, which we identified as actually quite successful initiatives. And what was the common denominator was also a campaign, and how strong that campaign was, and whether there was a leader who led that movement. So some of the points that we came about is that we definitely need to help those grassroots movements to have a structure so they can actually optimize what they're doing and have an efficient and create efficiency. And in order to actually help them, we also need to provide easier access to funding. So as I believe Ansel already mentioned, or David, there needs to be a better way of a simplified way of application processes, of donations, a way where actually technology can help to give those grassroots movements access to money so they can continue their cause. And back as well, we talked about the technical issue of the tools that we use, because sometimes we use tools because it's easy, they're user friendly, but does that mean that they serve our mission, align with our vision? And questions like, why is nobody funding these tools? Again, going back to easy access to funding. And yeah, so these are a couple of the points that we came across. And one thing that is not here, but it was a decision that was made, is that as an action item, as a next step, to conclude at this summit, we thought of creating a guideline, a toolkit, let's say, with learnings from startups and founders, or from, let's say, taking from the startups methodology, or the business methodology, the corporate world, to apply that to the grassroots and NGOs, so that they can actually learn how to make the structures more efficient and to optimize the processes. So those are the key takeaways from me as well, and I'm really looking forward to the next day to also see the results. But so now, I mean, concluding this day, we have, of course, a really interesting keynote who would probably give more food for thought for all of these topics that we're discussing. Cory Doctorow, who's a special advisor at Electronic Frontier Foundation, science fiction author, activist, journalist, and blogger. And he's going to be talking about adversarial interoperability, an elegant weapon from a more civilized age. Cory, are you with us? And if so, can you turn on your camera, because I can't see you. Ah, there you are.
My camera is going, and you should be able to hear my audio. Am I there?
Yes,
Very
you're here. Okay,
hi, folks.
good.
Hi, Laird.
Hey, great to see you, Cory. Thanks.
Nice to see you too. So I'm going to try and put slides up. I've had mixed results with this, but let's see what happens.
I think I need to stop share my screen.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Can you try now?
Oh, it does ask me which of my desktops to use. Great. Okay, share. Good. And then put that into Presso mode. And you should be seeing my slides. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. And Laird, lovely to continue our long association. I'm so glad to have been invited. So I want to be maybe the naysayer in the room here. I want to talk about the limits of transparency, not to say that we don't need transparency, but rather to say that transparency on its own has a unique and pretty terrible failure mode that is maybe at least as bad as opacity, if not worse. And you could not ask for a better example of the special failure mode of transparency than the police body camera. The theory goes that if you force cops into transparency, right, if you force them to record all of their interactions, that this will moderate their conduct because they'll be on notice that those interactions will be viewable later. But the reality, at least in the US, has been quite the reverse, that that police, because they know they can operate with impunity, because they know that there are virtually no penalties, right? If you commit a crime, the prosecutors will decline to prosecute it. If you commit misconduct, your police union will shield you from it. If you are sued by one of your victims for human rights abuses, the courts will give you qualified immunity. That there's not really any reason to care that your misdeeds are being captured for posterity. And so the result is that we now know in exquisite detail just how brutal American policing is. You can turn on Twitter or the news every day and watch a new snuff video in which a police officer murders someone. The result of that transparency has not, to say the least, been an increased trust in policing. Quite the reverse. What we've got instead is a policing nihilism, right? A belief that policing itself is a fully flawed institution that cannot be reformed, which, you know, I personally think I agree with. But if the purpose of giving the police body cameras was to make a meeting of minds where the police would moderate their conduct and the public would see that moderation and have a renewed trust in police, I think we can say that transparency on its own, transparency without the possibility for change, did worse than nothing, right? It just illustrated absolutely that there was no redemption for this institution, and it did not incentivize the institution to improve or redeem itself. And technology is one of those zones where there is an enormous amount of transparency and very little opportunity for users to act on that transparency to demand change. So let's talk about some of the origins of transparency in software. In 1983, the term free software was coined to describe software that was licensed in such a way that it could be run by its users, that the source code, the code that made the software go, could be read by its users, that users could improve that source code, and that they could publish those improvements so that other people could benefit from them. And in 1998, the term free software was largely superseded by a much more instrumental term, a term that, instead of stressing the freedom that you got with free software, stressed the openness, the transparency. And that term was open source. And it was meant to be a kind of rebrand on free software to make people less afraid. And rather than emphasizing freedom, the term open source really, it emphasized transparency and its benefits, a set of utilitarian benefits, like if you let enough people look at your source code, they'll find the defects in it and help you correct them. And maybe you can harness a team of volunteers that will lower your software development costs. So rather than making the ethical case for freedom, instead we made the utilitarian case for transparency. And for more than a decade, the distinction between open source and free software was viewed largely as a semantic one, right? That open source was how you talked about free software so you wouldn't scare business people. But by dismissing freedom in favor of openness, the open source software movement paved the way for a very different world. So today, every major online service is powered by open source software. You can download the code that does the key infrastructure tasks for Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft's cloud services. You can change that code as much as you like, but you cannot change how Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Facebook are using that code. You can change the code on your own computer, but you can't change how you interact with that code in the world on their clouds. And since all of the code that you might write and run needs to talk to their clouds to do any useful work, you have openness that gives you precisely nothing by way of freedom. So this is a situation where we have perfect transparency into the functional specifications of the big platforms, but zero opportunity to do anything if you don't like those specifications. Software freedom still exists, but it's the exclusive purview of tech giants. Tech giants get software freedom and we get open source, right? We have the right to see and improve the code they use. They get the freedom to decide which of those improvements they will incorporate. Now, a lot has changed since 1983 when free software was born. In the last several decades, we have seen, among other things, a rise of terrible market concentration. You know, today the web primarily consists of 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. The internet has given us the rise of software as a service, where the main body of the code doesn't run on your own computer. And those are pretty important shifts, but I want to focus on a shift that has been dramatically under-theorized and under-commented upon, but a shift that I think is the most important of those shifts. and that's the shift in interoperability. Interoperability is when you have two or more products or services that work together, right? You can take the SIM out of the phone that you bought from one company and put it into a phone that you bought from another company. The SIMs and the phones interoperate. You can buy a cigarette lighter USB charger for €1 from a fishbowl at the counter at a petrol station, and you can plug it into your car. You can screw any light bulb into your light socket, and you can use anyone's shoelaces in your shoes. That's interoperability. But not all interoperability is created equal. There are at least 3 different kinds of interoperability. The first one is cooperative interoperability. That's when a service or a product is designed to be used in concert with a whole bunch of other competing services and products. You know, it adheres to a standard. It offers an API, which is how a programmer that isn't affiliated with a company can make a product that interoperates with an existing one. And there's documentation and other tools that actively assist people in doing interoperable things with existing products. So for example, if you go and you look at the published specification for HTML, you can make a web page that any browser can load up in its windows without having to do a deal with the browser vendor. If you create a battery that uses a standard USB charger, then anyone who makes a USB device can plug a USB cable into the USB charger port and into their device, and you can charge that device. By making a screw with a number 8 Phillips head, anyone who has a screwdriver that's a number 8 Phillips can screw that screw into a board. So that's what cooperative interoperability looks like. And we're all pretty familiar with it. It's kind of the water we swim in. And then there's the indifferent interoperability. Interoperability where the manufacturer doesn't care that you are doing something interoperable, but doesn't take any steps to stop you. So for example, you might have a kitchen mixer that's designed to mix food, but no one stops you from mixing paint in it. Excel wasn't designed to make video games, but clever people have figured out how to write Pac-Man in Microsoft Excel. The window that the architect designed for your house was not designed to accommodate a flower box, but you can hang a flower box off your windowsill and grow a little herb garden in it. We're very familiar with both of these forms of interoperability, but there's a third kind of interoperability, the most important kind of interoperability of all, and it's one that has been nearly hunted to extinction today, and that is adversarial interoperability. Adversarial interoperability is when you make a new product or service and you add it to an existing one against the wishes of the company that made that existing product or service. It's when you are actively doing something that the existing market actor doesn't want you to do, and you do it anyway. So the example that everyone's familiar with is third-party printer ink. HP really wants you to pay more than the cost of vintage Veuve Clicquot for black ink for your printer. And there are a whole bunch of companies that will offer you either fresh ink to refill your HP cartridge or cartridges that work with your HP printer that will allow you to print without having to spend as much as you would for vintage Veuve. If you go to a mechanic, they might offer you third-party parts. Or if you go to a phone repair shop, they might offer you third-party parts for your phone or your car. Or you might get a jailbreaking tool for your iPhone that lets you run third-party software that Apple itself hasn't blessed and that someone else has made and wants to let you run, even though Apple might prefer that you not run it. For example, you might be a Uyghur or other Turkic Muslim in China who wants to run a working VPN so that the Chinese government can't spy on you and put you in a concentration camp. Apple has removed all the working VPNs to make it easier for the Chinese government to round up disfavored minorities. So you might want to install a piece of software that Apple hasn't blessed. All of those are examples of adversarial interoperability. And adversarial interoperability has a long and honorable history in technology. It's what's kept technology so vibrant for most of its history. You know, when it looked like Microsoft was going to take over every office environment in the world by leveraging its dominance of Microsoft Office and Microsoft Windows, Apple went and reverse engineered the file format for Microsoft Office, and it made the iWork suite, Pages, Numbers, Keynote, that could read and write Microsoft Office files, even though Microsoft itself didn't want them to be able to do it. And by allowing people who lived in an office that where they had a Mac and everyone else had a PC to read and write the documents that their PC colleagues were making, Apple rescued itself from being edged out of the Office market by the dominant player. Google, when it started, it had a crawler that went around and made a copy of every web page on the internet by pretending to be a browser, by saying to the web server, hello, I'm just a person with a computer and I just need to get a copy of this web page so that I can show it to my user. And really what it was doing is making an index of them to make a search engine. And Microsoft DOS, right, the grandfather of the tech boom, Microsoft DOS ran on a variety of PCs from companies like Compaq and Gateway and Dell, and every one of those PCs had a ROM, the brain of the computer, that was made by a company called Phoenix. Phoenix did a clean room reverse engineer of the IBM chip, the ROM that powered the IBM PC, and made a clone of it so that third parties could compete directly with IBM. And they did so against IBM's wishes for obvious reasons. Now, adversarial interoperability has been with us for a very long time. I mean, the origin of cable TV was that TV salespeople in Pennsylvania knew that they couldn't sell TVs to people whose rooftop antennas were too small to get the broadcasts from Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. And so they erected what they called community antennas, very, very tall antennas that had wires that went from their base into the homes of the TV salesman's customers. And the TV salesman charged them money for access to signals from the broadcasters that they retransmitted without payment, without permission, and against the wishes of broadcasters. But today there's almost no adversarial interoperability to be found in the wild. The big example that we still see, and thank goodness for it, is ad blocking. Ad blocking is the largest consumer boycott in history. About 1 in 4 internet users run some form of ad block. But there are very few people apart from the ad block companies who would dare to give their users the power to modify the products and services that they use in ways that benefit those users rather than the shareholders of the companies that made the product. How did this happen? How did we lose adversarial interoperability? Well, the very same companies that used adversarial interoperability to unseat the incumbent rivals that they challenged sought out legal means of annihilating adversarial interoperability once they themselves had ascended to the top of the food pyramid. They created ways to annihilate adversarial interoperability that prevented anyone from doing to them what they had done to the dominant players when they first entered the market. So companies like Facebook distorted anti-hacking laws to make terms of service violations into literal felonies. And Apple, Microsoft, and Google have gone to great lengths to expand software patents, copyright law, and trade secrecy in a way that suppresses new competitors who would take actions that are in every respect identical ethically and from a kind of high-level technical perspective to the actions they took to dominate the markets that they're now in. Singly and in chorus, these tech giants have pushed for laws and policies that would have made their own path to dominance into a crime. Every day they prove and prove again that what every pirate really wants is to become an admiral. So let's go back to 1983. Back in 1983, the free software movement had a demand that companies would make adversarial interoperability easier by publishing their source code under license terms that allowed others to improve and republish it. Their position was, we have the right to reverse engineer your products. Nothing stops us from doing it, but it's so tedious to figure out how they work without your cooperation. Won't you please make our lives easier? So while the open source movement was eclipsing the free software movement, taking away user software freedom and giving it to corporations, there was this other incredibly profound thing going on, that this dominant means of interoperability without permission, was being dismantled. The default changed. When free software was born, the default was that you could reverse engineer anything, but maybe you could ask the company to make your job easier. But over the next couple of decades, the default changed so that we now live in a world where if something doesn't work the way you want it to, you can't just fix it. You now have to grovel with companies to publish and license their source code to make it easier to fix their broken products. The only time we get to fix a product to make it work better for us is if the company gives us permission to do so. We lost adversarial interoperability, and we even lost the indifferent interoperability, where you might take an action not against the wishes of the company, but to the side of the wishes of the company, something that the company may not mind, but that your lawyers will tell you, well, if you take this action, the company would be within their rights to sue you or even ask a prosecutor to put you in jail because you had to reverse engineer a software lock, because you violated their terms of service, because you violated one of their software patents. And that by taking these actions, even if you were pretty sure the company wouldn't mind, you were risking a prison sentence. So we lost all of that. And all we have left is permission, the dwindling hope that that companies will play fair and give us the right to modify the products and services that we rely on out of the goodness of their hearts. We've created a regime where challenging dominant companies requires permission, and not just any permission, but permission from the very same companies that we hope to challenge. We have made the companies custodians of their own markets with the power to decide precisely who is allowed to compete with them and how. So let's go back to transparency. You can go to GitHub right now and download the source code for all the major infrastructure in every major tech platform, and not just the Western ones, the Russian ones and the Chinese ones too. But you cannot do one thing about them. Now, I don't want to paint the past as a rosy utopia. When I say that if you didn't like the way that products and services worked, you could fix them, what I mean by that is that for most of us, we could hope that a technical expert who had the same needs as us would go ahead and fix them and we would benefit from their actions. Only a minority of us had those technical skills to effect those changes, and an even smaller minority had the budget to hire a technical expert to make the changes that we wanted. But in the days of adversarial interoperability, we imagined that there might be a fix for this. Whole movements sprung up to pass technical knowledge to disfavored and marginalized groups so that they could fix their own tools and services. It's a commonplace to observe that we've gone backwards since those days, chasing brown and black people out of the tech industry, further marginalizing women and poor people and people from the global south in technical roles. But it's actually even worse than that, because even if you learn how to seize the means of information, even if you learn how to shape the tools others made to suit your needs and fit your hand, you can only do so with permission, with forbearance from a giant that barely notices you or that you exist. And that will only grant that permission if they can be absolutely certain that you will not gore any of their shareholders' oxen. It turns out that those nerdy middle-class kids with Apple II Pluses in 1983 weren't the future of poor kids who are excluded from technological decision-making. It was the other way around. Those poor kids were the future of the rest of us. That they were pioneers of the future in which you can know everything about how the system works and not be allowed to change one thing about it unless you ask and say please first. And it's getting worse. Companies that make toaster ovens and insulin pumps and car engines have figured out that if they add some of that same code that Apple uses to stop you from running your own apps, that they can do the same trick. Make it illegal to buy your own parts, services, apps, and consumables from anyone except them. So for example, whoops, I'm missing a slide here. Oh no, missing a slide. Pretend you're looking at a GE refrigerator now. For example, if you try and replace the $55 proprietary water filter that comes with your GE refrigerator with the $18 generic one that you can buy anywhere online, that fridge will refuse to run because it will sense that it is running with a third-party filter and that you have cheated the shareholders out of their due. And if you try to fix your refrigerator so that it can accept any old filter, so that you give it orders instead of taking orders from it, you risk felony prosecution under the European Copyright Directive and the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which both felonize bypassing a lock that protects access to a copyrighted work, like the software in the fridge. Everyone has learned precisely the wrong and worst lesson from tech companies, that if you add a thin veneer of software locks to your products, you can make it a literal crime for your customers to act in ways that displease your shareholders. But don't worry, the tech industry still has some innovation left in it. They're innovating and finding new forms of absolute fuckery that criminalize interoperability even more. So Oracle is presently suing Google, arguing that copying the syntax of the API, that's the code that lets one programmer write a product that talks to another product, that copying this functional syntax is a copyright violation. And if they win, that will be yet another game of musical chairs that they have won, another dominant position that they will freeze in place forever and ever. So with all due respect to all the people doing amazing work on transparency transparency is not enough. Transparency on its own is a recipe for disaster. The best you can hope for from transparency without a means to change the things it reveals is that it might inspire the rage that goes on to smash the system. We need an interoperator's defense. We need laws that grant broad immunity to people who repair, improve, or analyze existing products and services. And while we're waiting for it, we need a moratorium on every law, rule, and regulation that gives companies the right to decide who gets to make those changes. Transparency is absolutely necessary, sure. It is necessary but insufficient as a condition for a better world. We need to stop arguing about when or how tech companies should give us permission to fix their broken products. We need to start demanding the right to make those products work for us, even and especially if the companies that made them like it that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corey. That was great. That was really good. I would like to address now to the public to see if there's any questions here for the talk that Corey just gave.
I know it's all very non-controversial and facially obvious, so I can understand if no one had any room.
I like your remark. I really like your remark around the Oracle and Google, or all of this conglomerates game essentially on power, but more like a comment rather than a question here. I would say. And yes, it was a comment that was made also in the beginning of in the previous panel, how essentially lying in order to get away with activities or processes or procedures is a common behavior. Yeah, I would argue actually, like potentially even universally in human beings. So, and honesty is probably something that is missing. But what would be your suggestion here? How can we exit this circle, the system that we're part of?
Well, I think it's going to be, excuse me. I think it's going to be, oh my goodness. Excuse me, I'm sure that is disgusting to listen to with your earbuds. I think it's going to be an iterative process, right? The reason that we get these policies that are so obviously bad is because the industries are very, very concentrated. And when industries are concentrated, they lobby better, right? For one thing, there are fewer parties, and so it's easier to ensure that no one defects, right? Everyone can show up and sing from the same songbook and tell lawmakers that they all need the same thing. And also when they're very concentrated, they extract monopoly rents, right? They have more profit, and they can divert some of that profit to regulatory adventures that allow them to try and enact their political will and turn it into policy. And so ultimately what we need to do is weaken the industries by making them more diverse, more pluralistic, and less concentrated. But you can't do that in one fell swoop because they will defend themselves very thoroughly. I debated Marguerite Vestager last year at Republica in Berlin. She's the European Antitrust Commissioner, and she said, or Monopoly Commissioner rather, and she said that she didn't think it was worth the commission's while to try and break up the likes of Facebook or Google because they have billions of dollars and they would tie them up in court for decades and exhaust the budget and resources of these anti-monopoly, pro-competition elements of the European Commission. So you have to weaken the firms in order to break them up. And paradoxically, you have to break them up in order to weaken them. So I think what we need to do is, just as if you've ever tried to, I am the world's worst parallel parker. And so I am very, very familiar with the process of really working very hard to just gain like half a centimeter of space by turning the wheel this way and tapping the accelerator very slowly, and then reaching the limit of how far you can go. So maybe we can win a tiny victory by blocking a bad policy. So right now, for example, all of the European nations are enacting the copyright directive, which is going to just enshrine the power of the tech platforms. It says that, you know, you can't operate an online platform unless you have hundreds of millions of euros to operate a copyright filter, which excludes the entire European tech industry and will leave just the US tech players there. So we have the opportunity in those national implementations to preserve some space for competition. And I don't think that solves the problem. But what I think that does do is it reduces the amount of windfall profit that the firms have, so that maybe we can contemplate a more thoroughgoing action like a breakup. Or we're seeing, I believe Australia and one other territory are seeking to block the merger of Facebook and Giphy. So maybe we start to block prospective mergers to keep the firms from continuing to grow and dominate their space. And then as we weaken them, maybe we bring one tactical antitrust action against them to break them up. So it may take 20 years to try and get Facebook to divest of Instagram or Google to divest of its ad tech companies. But in those 20 years, every other firm in the market will be watching this company squandering billions of dollars and spending every hour that God sends trying to keep themselves intact because the regulators have decided to take aim at them. And that might make them tamer. You know, Bill Gates said last year at a conference that the reason Microsoft didn't buy Android and allowed Google to buy it is because they were still distracted from the antitrust action against them over the browser wars. But the Android acquisition was 8 years after the browser wars, right? So what Bill Gates is saying is that 8 years after the DOJ cut its losses and walked away from breaking up Microsoft, Microsoft's executives were still so scarred and gun shy that they could not bring themselves to take the kind of anti-competitive action that 8 years before they were doing, and today they're doing again. You know, buying companies like GitHub and LinkedIn and so on. But there was this moment of, you know, this lasting moment of forbearance from that was brought about as a consequence of the trauma of being dragged up and down the Autobahn for 10 years by antitrust regulators on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think that this iterative process gets us somewhere. And I think also that tech has an opportunity, people who care about the destiny of tech have an opportunity to build coalitions and solidarity with people who care about other industries. You know, there's one Italian company, Luxottica, which is backed by a private equity fund that has bought not only every high street retailer of glasses, they've also bought every eyewear brand. And if a brand refuses to sell to them like Oakley did, they take all of that brand's products out of every high street retailer until the brand is on the verge of bankruptcy. And then they make another acquisition offer at 10 cents on the dollar because now the company's been brought to its knees. So there are people out there who want to know why their spectacles cost 1,000% of what they did 10 years ago and why there's so much less variety in the market. We have an opportunity to make common cause with those people and say the same forces that took away your choice in eyeglasses took away your choice in social media. And it's not just tech and it's not just eyeglasses. Every major industry has been subject to the same kind of concentration. Oil and gas, finance, mobile telephony, and wireline ISPs. Professional wrestling had 30 leagues 25 years ago. Now there's one league. It's owned by an evil billionaire named Vince McMahon, who gives lots of money to Donald Trump, and who, because he owns the only major league in the industry, has been able to recast all of the performers in wrestling as contractors who no longer get medical insurance. And as a consequence, all of the beloved stars of professional wrestling are dying in their 50s because they can't afford medical care. And GoFundMe is full of wrestlers, beloved wrestlers, begging their fans for pennies to pay for the medical treatment they need to treat the lifelong injuries they acquired in the ring. Those wrestling fans have the same cause as people who want to know why the web is 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. You know, in the 1970s, we had people who thought that the biggest issue was owls, and other people who thought that it was whales or the ozone layer or pollution in fresh water. And then the term ecology came along, and it showed them that what we had wasn't just a bunch of issues, but a movement, a cause, right? We have a moment here where we can take all of these different issues, eyeglasses, professional wrestling, the destiny of computers, finance, oil and gas, every one of these industries that is so concentrated and so corrupt, and weld them into a single movement of people who have a common cause.
I am speechless. I have nothing to add. It's yes, I agree. I guess. And you're right. I mean, I suppose we do have the chance and opportunity now, but hasn't it always been that case? But I would like to actually, there's 5 questions. I don't want to monopolize the questions, so I will actually ask I will ask from the audience. So Stephen, Tatum has asked, how do patents and intellectual property fit into your ideas for a more positive future, Corey?
Well, I think patents have become part of the thicket against adversarial interoperability, as has the expansion of copyright. You know, you'll note that like Oracle's theory about APIs is just an expansion of copyright from which historically copyright has not covered functional works, and what they're arguing is that APIs aren't really functional works, and APIs are nothing but functional works. But they're making this argument, and they may yet win in court. And I think that, you know, the lesson of Oracle and the lesson of software patents, which in theory have been limited or banned in many territories, but still keep sneaking in, is that when firms have a lot of money, they can turn that resource to figuring out how to transform existing doctrines that have been deliberately narrowed by lawmakers to prevent this kind of anti-competitive activity, and to expand them back into anti-competitive realms, to turn them back into anti-competitive weapons. And that they have kind of endless ingenuity, right? They may not be innovating on products anymore, but they're definitely innovating on monopolistic tactics. And I think the answer to this is that rather than trying to craft laws that are so narrow that they cannot be weaponized, I think it's more important to craft legal defenses that are so broad that they can withstand these assaults. So, for example, in the realm of whistleblower laws, there are many countries and territories that have laws that say, you know, notwithstanding trade secrecy, copyright, government classification, or any other law, statute, or regulation, revealing evidence of criminal misconduct is never a crime, right? So you are effectively immunized from liability under any statute if what you are doing reveals a crime. So imagine an interoperator's defense that goes something like that, notwithstanding patent, copyright, trademark, you know, trade secrecy, non-compete, contract law, anti-hacking law, or any other law, statute, or regulation. It is never a crime to take such steps as are necessary to repair, improve, or compete with an existing product or service, provided you do so in a way that is otherwise lawful on behalf of a bona fide user. And yes, this will send us back to the courts to decide whether you are making a lawful alteration on behalf of a bona fide user, but it moves courts away from the procedural question of did you violate a patent? Which you almost certainly will, because every conceivable thing you can do with a computer has been patented in a flurry of bad patents that were granted by the US Patent and Trademark Office, and a kind of breathtaking abdication of its responsibility to inspect patents for quality and so on. Rather than answering that procedural question, it will have to ask a much more important question, which is like, did you take a legitimate act on behalf of a bona fide user? Right? Absent copyright and absent the fact that you had to violate a copyright to do the thing, was the thing itself lawful? In the same way that, you know, absent you had to violate copyright in order to blow the whistle on a crime, was there an actual crime taking place, right? Were you serving that higher goal? And, you know, the devil is in the details about how such a thing would be implemented and what territories it would be in and which ones it wouldn't. Although you could imagine that the first territory that did it would have a huge advantage, because it could have an ICT sector that was able to make and export products and tools for repair, for service, and for improvement that other territories might try to keep out with their firewalls, right? Because many of these tools would be delivered as software. But that they would struggle to leave out, and they would have an economic advantage. So, you know, it's possible the first territory to do that would gain a real competitive advantage over other countries. And it would go a long way to improving the status quo, because the status quo doesn't just chill people from taking actions. It also, where actions must be taken, puts people in harm's way. So, for example, John Deere, which is part of the duopoly that controls all agricultural equipment, John Deere has criminalized effecting your own repairs on its tractors. You know, you can take the part from John Deere and put it in your tractor, but the John Deere tractor will not recognize it until a technician comes from John Deere's head office and charges you $170 to type an unlock code into the keyboard. Now, there are people all over the world in the agricultural sector who can't wait for John Deere to come out and bless their repair, right? There's a hailstorm coming. They need to get the harvest in. And so what they do is they download bootleg firmware for their tractors from Ukraine that no one knows who makes it. No one knows what's in it. It's a black box. All they know is it lets your tractor run without John Deere's intercession. Well, you know, good for them. They get the crop in, but it is like a serious problem that an increasing sector of our food security is dependent on black box code written by parties unknown who cannot reveal themselves lest they face felony prosecution, and whose either intentional or unintentional errors leave their users with no recourse. So if there was an opportunity to make third-party tractor firmware that accomplished this lawful end, and if the barrier that stood between you was not, did you violate a patent or bypass a copyright law, but rather, do you think a judge would agree that what you did was legitimate? I think there are people who would take that risk. And so I think that there is scope for solving this without having to perfect every existing law to make sure that it's never used anti-competitively.
Thank you, Corey. There's a lot of questions. How many would you like to answer?
Well, I mean, we had an hour, right? So we've got another 22 minutes.
Cool. All right. Yes, I can continue.
Okay.
So Mike Richardson asks, so web scraping is criminalized? Question mark.
Well, that is an excellent question. A company called Power Ventures made a tool that allowed Facebook users to do scraping at what's called autopiloting, right? So it's when you scrape data out of a Facebook account on behalf of a Facebook user, and then you allow that user to push data into their Facebook account from another interface. So it was like a unified dashboard that would let you talk to your Facebook account, your LinkedIn account, and many other products, right? It took all your social telephones and married them under one window. And Facebook had done something very similar in its own origin. When Facebook began, it was challenged by the fact that there was this dominant rival called MySpace. MySpace had very deep pockets. It had been acquired by Rupert Murdoch. He's not a fellow who's known for being gentle with his competitors. And so Facebook had to figure out what to do about the fact that everyone who might want to use social media to kind of a first approximation was locked inside of MySpace's walled garden. So Facebook made an autopilot tool. You could give it your login and password, and it would go to MySpace, scrape all the messages waiting for you and put them in your Facebook inbox, let you reply to them and pilot them back out into your MySpace outbox and send them to your friends who are still using MySpace. And you could add a little footer that said, I sent this from Facebook. Why are you still using MySpace? So when Power Ventures came along and did to Facebook, what Facebook had done to Power Ventures, Facebook sued them under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. This is a criminal and civil statute from 1986 that Ronald Reagan signed into law in a panic over the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick. This is real. The federal prosecutors had for years been pushing for a very broad computer crime statute, and the panic that ensued from the movie War Games gave them the opportunity to push for an extremely expansive anti-hacking law that defined hacking as exceeding your authorization on another computer. So if you were allowed to do X and Y, but not Z on a computer, and you did X, Y, and Z, then you were hacking. And so Facebook brought a suit against Power Ventures, arguing that Power Ventures had violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act by doing to Facebook almost exactly what Facebook had done to MySpace. And they secured a judgment. But now we have a circuit split, because another circuit in the US has now argued that scraping is lawful. And this time it relates to Microsoft. So Microsoft acquired LinkedIn, and LinkedIn had a user, a company that rode on top of LinkedIn that scraped public job listings and public job seeking on LinkedIn to give employers intelligence. Basically, they spied on employers' employees to figure out whether they were looking for other jobs, and they would give them reports. You know, your top engineer is publicly on LinkedIn looking for these jobs, and this company was called HiQ, and LinkedIn had tolerated HiQ's activity for many years, but after the Microsoft acquisition, when it needed to figure out how to make enough money to justify the top dollar that Microsoft had paid for it, they decided to launch a rival service to HiQ's. So they weren't trying to lock HiQ out to give their users more privacy. They just wanted to be the sole arbiter of when that user's privacy was violated. And they sued HiQ, and HiQ won. And not only did the HiQ win, and the court said that there wasn't a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act violation in HiQ's scraping of publicly available data on LinkedIn, even though it violated LinkedIn's terms of service, the court actually ordered LinkedIn to stop trying to interfere with HiQ, right, to allow HiQ to proceed unencumbered. So now we have a circuit split, which means that the law is uncertain. And we are waiting probably for someone to bring a case to the Supreme Court so the Supreme Court can tell us which side of this it's on. But to all intents and purposes, the existence of the Power Ventures case means that in the main, very few firms are going to be willing to take the risk. And more importantly, very few funders are going to be willing to fund those who want to take that risk. That if you go to a venture capitalist and you say, I want to do this thing that involves scraping, that the venture capitalist will say, well, what will you do when they sue you under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? And you say, well, I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that the court likes the HiQ decision more than the Power Ventures decision. The venture capitalist is going to say no thanks, which is how big tech has acquired what financiers call the kill zone, right? Any line of business that one of the big tech platforms is in, no one wants to invest in competing with, even though these firms are bringing in billions of dollars and experiencing double-digit year-on-year growth. Right? Under normal circumstances, that would just be a signal to competitors to enter their market and try to take a piece of it for themselves. But today, there's very little of that. In Europe, the story is a little different, but I don't think much better. So Europe has really taken the view that it's too late to do anything about the big tech platforms, that their dominance is effectively complete and perpetual. And so instead of asking them to or expecting them to be broken up or to yield to a successor or a group of successors that might do a better job, instead what we're doing is we're deputizing them with state-like duties and insisting that they perform these duties, that they tame themselves, that they become effectively regulated monopolies in the model of Ericsson or British Telecom or Deutsche Telekom, these so-called national champions that were allowed to dominate their markets, and in exchange were expected to undertake action as a kind of quasi official arm of the state. So last year we saw the passage of the Terror Regulation and the Copyright Directive, which both assign the platforms to monitor all user contributions and to take proactive steps to interdict anything that seems to violate various speech regimes, copyright, anti-extremism laws, hate speech laws, and so on. And the impact of that is that it gives the platforms a much better case for blocking scraping. Because if the position is that the platforms must stop people from doing unauthorized things on their platform, they're going to say, well, the way that we prevent that unauthorized activity is by having perfect insight into all the activity on the platform. We watch everything that you do to catch you engaged in harassing conduct or to watch you probing our copyright filters to find systematic holes in them that you can exploit to infringe copyright and what have you. And if we are required to allow third parties to interact with our service, we will be unable to moderate their conduct to the extent that we are expected to under law. That, effectively what they become is a kind of constitutional monarchy where they're given eternal rule and they suffer themselves to be draped in golden chains by a kind of House of Lords, an aristocracy made up of regulators who are largely drawn from their own ranks and who cycle in and out between the firms and into governance. And who see as the primary issue to make sure that the firms govern wisely and not that their governance is ever challenged. And so in both instances, I fear that scraping is endangered. And I think we really do need to push back.
Thank you for the comment. Another question from Vladimir Kuparinen. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. What do you propose practically? Grassroots movement, revolt, break down GAFAM. GAFAM.
It's Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, GAFAM.
GAFAM.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Change regulators who are not active, corrupted.
Yeah. So Larry Lessig has this framework for social change. He calls, the four forces that act on our policy world, on our lives. He says that our lives are regulated by code, which is what's technologically possible, markets, what's profitable, law, what's lawful, and norms, what's socially acceptable. And oftentimes we get stuck in one tactic, right? So we go like, well, we can't make any more tools to break down Facebook's hegemony or Apple's hegemony or what have you, because we break the law. Therefore, we have no recourse. Or we say, well, we must change the law before we make tools. And I think that the right answer is to go as far as you can with one of these tactics. And when you reach the limit of how far that tactic can take you, to seek out another tactic. So say you reach the limits of your legal capabilities, right? Say you lose the copyright directive fight, as we did last year in March of 2019, when 5 Swedish MEPs clicked the wrong button when they were called on to vote, or at least claimed they clicked the wrong button, and therefore passed into law the controversial elements of the copyright directive. Well, it may be that we now need to switch to a normative fight. Right now, what we need to do is create the political will within the European member states that encourages them to implement the law in a way that maximizes the technical and normative freedom of users of the internet. So, the compromise that was used to pass the copyright directive into law included a rule that said that companies' filters should not unduly hamper legitimate speech, that they shouldn't capture things that aren't a copyright infringement or that take advantage of copyright's limitations and exceptions. They shouldn't interfere with the fundamental rights of Europeans. Well, anyone who understands both technology and law knows that this isn't possible, that you either have a filter that stops copyright infringement, or you have a filter that protects the rights of people who speak by defaulting to the assumption that if you can't tell whether something is or isn't a copyright infringement, that you should allow it to go. But you can't do both, right? That this is a zero-sum game. And so now regulators are going to have to decide what they're going to do, or rather national parliaments are going to have to decide what they're going to do. Either they enact a solution to this that enforces copyright at the expense of fundamental rights, or they enact a solution that enforces fundamental rights at the expense of perfect copyright enforcement. And if they go with the latter, right, if they allow copyright enforcement to trump fundamental rights, then what we'll have to do is the very long and expensive process of litigation. Right? We all have to become Max Schrems and spend a decade suing Facebook, basically, at that point. On the other hand, if we get them to favor fundamental rights over copyright, then we force the other side to expend a decade in litigation, and while we maintain a decade of forbearance, during which time there may be markets that come into play, during which time you might see firms that will emerge to take advantage of the competitive space still left in the market, who will themselves become stakeholders for a fairer regime, not because out of an ethical commitment, but just for self-preservation, right? And so now you have a movement that combines commercial operators that just want to, preserve their commercial longevity and their ability to operate in the market. And then you have ethical actors who care about speech, and they can be married on the same side of a legal fight, right? Because you've gotten markets to intervene because you won a legal battle, right? And so every one of these feeds the other, right? When something is technologically impossible, it's hard to get people to normatively care about it, right? Saying it's unfair that gravity acts so consistently upon us, and we should be able to turn off gravity when we have a backache. It's a lovely dream, but no one's going to take to the streets on your behalf. On the other hand, if someone actually bans your anti-gravity ray that people have been using to relieve their back pain, then you suddenly have constituents, right? Now you have your technological intervention has created a normative case for the preservation of that and against laws that would limit it. And so this diversity of tactics is what gives us a path forward, rather than having a precise roadmap from A to Z. what we can do instead is have a rule of thumb, right? A set of heuristics, which is what we do whenever the terrain is too complicated to traverse, right? If you're a software engineer who wants to navigate a data space that is so complex that by the time you enumerated all of its values, you would have gone past the point where a solution would have been useful to you. Instead, you use a heuristic. You try to ascend a gradient. You try to move in a direction in which the thing that you're looking for becomes more prevalent. The same way that an ant climbs a hill. You know, ants have just forward-facing eyes, right? They can't look up. So they don't know which direction they should go to reach the highest peak that's available to them from where they're standing. But ants have got all of these legs, and they can pull their legs and say which leg is on highest ground. And they can take a single step in that direction to that new higher place. And from there, they can once again pull their legs and go, okay, well, now this leg's on the highest ground, and take another step that way, right? Without having to know all of the terrain, you can still find your way in this stepwise fashion to the local maximum, the highest peak that's available to you from where you're standing. And so, you know, while I appreciate that it would be great if we had a precise roadmap, a call to action, go and do A, B, and C, and X, Y, and Z will happen. Instead, I think the best we can hope for is this suite of tactics and a goal we can agree on. And that goal is a pluralistic internet where users have technological self-determination, and the tactics are code, law, norms, and markets.
Thank you very much, Corey. There's also one follow-up question from Vladimir. Could we use the web reinvented by Tim Berners-Lee instead of internet spoiled by GAFM?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking about Solid, Tim's new project. I mean, Solid is great as far as it goes, like as a framework for developing apps, it's fine. And certainly it allows for more direct user control because the users get to keep their data locally. But the issue is that people don't want to pay the cost of switching, and firms have made it such that the switching costs are very, very high, right? Like that, you know, Facebook doesn't have users, it has hostages. And when you leave Facebook, they still have all of your friends and all their social relations hostage. We've never really had a technological transition in which people said, well, the old thing has lots of virtues, things that I like about it, but it's controlled by someone I don't like, or it has some characteristic I don't like. Therefore, I'm going to make a wholesale shift into something new. Instead, what we've had is this thing where people were able to keep hold of the vine they were holding on until they had a solid grip on the vine they were grabbing. You know, the Protestant Reformation didn't involve writing a new Bible, right? The Protestant Reformation involved taking the same Bible and using it in a different way. And so, you know, the fact that Tim has nailed some theses to the door is great, and they're good theses, but it's unrealistic to say to everybody, okay, everyone, to solve the collective action problem, we are all going to stop using Facebook on Wednesday, and on Thursday, we'll switch to solid-based, distributed, federated Facebook. Instead, what we should be doing is demanding the right to do to Facebook what Facebook did to MySpace, right? To have one foot in either platform. And there are some regulatory proposals to force interoperability on them. There's a review now of the data portability elements of the GDPR. The California privacy law imported some of those data portability elements. Senator Mark Warner in the US has proposed an interoperability bill that has some data portability elements where you have these third-party data fiduciaries that you know, evaluate new users who or new firms that want to help users live both in Facebook and on a new platform while they wait for their friends to join them there. And those are all good as far as they go, but they should be the floor on interoperability. The floor on interoperability should be things that the laws require that the firms voluntarily permit. The ceiling should be adversarial interoperability. The ceiling should be, I don't care whether you like it. It's our data, it's our community. We're going to figure out how to get it out of your platform one step at a time, not holus bolus. And if you don't like it, sue us, and we will invoke our rights to our data, to our community, to our self-determination, and to a pluralistic internet. That anything short of that just turns into just another regulated monopoly, right? If you tell Facebook, here are the contours that you must hew to in order to operate on the right side of the law, Facebook will find another means of taking its users hostage, right? It's those are the means that they use today because they're the most ready means at hand. But there's nothing to say that they can't invent new means, right? That they can't do what Oracle is doing and conjure out of whole cloth new legal doctrines out of existing ones that they can, through extensive lobbying, by paying law professors to write law review articles, by doing all of the things that the tobacco industry did to fight the connection between tobacco and cancer, or that the oil industry did to fight the connection between oil and climate change, that they can't go on inventing weapons to maintain these very high barriers to entry for new entrants to the market.
Great. And the million, Vladimir also said thanks Corey, and for this transformation from GAFAM developing mass products enhancement by a seamless interface, namely paper books with digital twins equals 2 products in 1 for seamless access to the new internet, the human-centric web. So Mike, yeah, that's the last question now, the $1 million question. So will we see a death penalty for copyright infringement? When will this happen? When will an American police SWAT team do a knock entry to seize a modded GE fridge as an example, or has this already occurred?
Well, what we did get was Hadopi in France, the 3 strikes law, which was so unpopular and the administrator was so corrupt that they never managed to enforce it. But it was the 3 strikes rule. After 3 copyright infringements, your ISP takes away your internet service. New Zealand passed a similar law, 92A, and then the UK passed this as the Digital Economy Bill. And thus far, these laws have been unenforced, but they haven't been repealed, although Hadopi, I believe, has been dismantled. But, the Digital Economy Bill still provides for secondary legislation, what Brits call it secondary legislation, regulation from the Secretary of State to enact at their pleasure rules to have mandatory disconnection orders for people who are accused of copyright infringement. I think that it would be very difficult at this point. I think that the pandemic has actually gone a long way to ending the debate about whether internet access is a human right. Finland declared internet access to be a human right, I believe, 15 years ago. And at the time, people laughed. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a column about how the internet has nothing to do with legitimate protest, that real protest involves people marching and so on. And yet, the pandemic took us from a place where everything we did involved the internet, and where being disconnected from the internet was an extremely painful, difficult, exclusionary measure, to a world in which everything we do requires the internet. And at that point, I think it is going to be much harder politically for any government to campaign on saying, we think that if we think that you live with someone who watched TV the wrong way, we're going to take away the tool that you use to earn your paycheck, get your health care, conduct your romantic life, keep in touch with your family, and so on and so on. I think that it's probably a dead letter, but stranger things have happened.
Stranger things happen indeed. Thank you so much, Corey, for being here with us and for sharing all your your research and your thoughts. It's been very, very interesting. Michael Mishka said here on the chat, great talk. I'm sure everybody else has been here have really enjoyed it. It's been definitely food for thought in a lot of levels. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And right now, actually, for whoever is still brave and want to continue meeting with each other, I would like to. How do we applaud? Okay, how do we applaud? Says Mike. I will figure it out. Just give me a minute.
I think denial of service is the preferred way.
Denial of service it is. So yes, thank you very much. Super insightful. So Sonia, yes, everybody, we're really, really grateful. Thank you. It was very, very interesting and insightful. So for the brave ones, we continue if you want and meet in your tribe. So you can go there and meet other attendees. other than that, well, thank you everybody for being here, and really looking forward to continue the conversation tonight, or definitely continue tomorrow morning. So have a nice rest of the evening. I
you.
put the chat in the I put the
Alright.
link in the chat.